Thank you for joining us. As the anti-government demonstrations in Iran enter a third week, the president has addressed the unrest in a televised interview. Masoud Pejaiskian says protesters have legitimate grievances that must be addressed, but he has accused what he calls rioters and terrorist elements of causing havoc and puts the blame on the US and Israel. President Donald Trump has said the United States will hit Iran where it hurts if protesters are killed. This footage has emerged from a morgue outside of Tehran. It's unclear when it was taken, but it shows many body bags. Tehran hasn't confirmed the number of demonstrators killed, but activist groups based outside the country say it's in the hundreds. Iranian state television reports that more than 100 security personnel have been killed. Internet and telecommunications services have been largely cut off since Thursday as security forces intensify their crackdown on demonstrators. Footage like this, broadcast by state media, shows significant destruction in several cities. Let's get the latest with Al Jazeera's Tawheed Asadi, who's in Tehran for us. The protests now, Tawheed, in their third week. How much momentum is there still, and how widespread are they?
Oh, well, yes, indeed. It's about more than 2 weeks that we have been witnessing protests across the country in different cities, including here in the capital. The climax dates back to Thursday night when we saw hundreds, and I may say thousands of people taking to the streets. And in some cases, the unrest flared up into violence as we saw confrontation between the security forces and the protesters, who just decided to throw trash bins and block streets, set them on fire. And it was like a chaotic situation. But since then, over the past 2-3 days, we have been situation being a little bit, I would insist, a little bit cooled down. And we see less, but it's still ongoing protests here and there in the capital and in other cities as well. Iranian President Masoud Pejaiskian came out with a statement today, at least taking just 3 important considerations into account. First, he tries to give this message to the protesters that he understands the economic difficulties that people are facing, and that comes in the context of soaring prices, high inflation, and the drastic devaluation of the local currency rial, which paved the way for many people to come to the streets and express their public dissatisfaction. This is there whether they take to the streets or not. Secondly, there is this security concern, as in some cases at least. We saw the protests going to a more violent level. And as you mentioned, we've got now reports saying that at least 100 security forces were killed. And of course, when it comes to fatalities, injuries, as well as the arrests among the protesters, we don't have any number that could be independently confirmed, as the country is dealing meanwhile with an internet shutdown, making it hard to access to reliable information in that regard. And there is a third point, and that is related to the possibility of a foreign intervention with respect to what we have been hearing from the US President Donald Trump about such a possibility. And now more reports are coming out to actually strengthen such a possibility, which is a serious security concern from the Iranian perspectives.
Tawheed, thank you for the update from Tehran. Tawheed Asadi. Let's discuss all this further now with Vali Nasser, who's a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins University. Vali, thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with what's happening in Iran and play a clip from President Pejaiskian's interview where he called for the country, for Iranians to unite against rioters. Let's listen to that and I'll come back to you.
The merchants closed the bazaar and they had criticisms. I had meetings with them and so did my ministers. We heard their complaints and we came to an understanding. We asked them to come and sit in a government meeting and they did. They told us their concerns. We will resolve their issues in every way that we can. I ask my dear people, wherever you are, get together and do not let them riot. The people should be on the scene. If people have concerns, it's our responsibility to listen and solve them. But the bigger responsibility is not to let a bunch of rioters come and cause chaos for the entire country. We ask our dear young people who have a certain analysis of the country's situation. We ask you not to be deceived by rioters and terrorists.
So, Vali, we heard there a noticeably conciliatory tone from President Pejaiskian towards protesters with economic grievances, while at the same time the language was much more harsh towards what officials label rioters or foreign-backed saboteurs. How credible, first of all, is this separation inside Iran today, and why use such rhetoric? To what end?
I mean, first of all, what he said, despite being conciliatory towards those who have economic grievances, was not that much different from what the Supreme Leader and other state leaders had said on January 9th, namely that the protests were now being driven by quote-unquote armed terrorists, people who wanted to please President Trump, as the Supreme Leader put it. Which means that the Iranian leadership deep down thinks that the protests are part of America and Israel's efforts to bring regime change in Iran. And this is happening in a context of war with Israel and the United States. Iran was at war with Israel and the United States 6 months ago. It expected that the war would resume. And now it's highly suspicious that the protests are being used by its adversaries to weaken or maybe topple the Islamic Republic. So I think this is not just rhetoric that they're giving to delegitimize the protesters. Some of that is there. But I think that Iran's leadership genuinely believes that it's deeply penetrated by foreign elements, by foreign-backed elements that are able to operate in Iran at will, the way that they witnessed during the war, and that the acts of sabotage, arson, setting fire to mosques and to government buildings were perhaps deliberate acts of aggravating the situation.
Yeah,
and they may be wrong on this. I'm not saying they're correct, but that's their operating theory.
I understand that. So we're seeing the demonstrations not just in major cities, but reportedly across provinces and smaller towns, not just in Tehran. How important is this geographic spread? And with the protests now in their third week, do you think they can last much longer? How long can this go on before the regime feels threatened?
Well, with the existence of internet and communication systems early on, obviously news spread across Iran very quickly, and protests also spread very quickly. Now the government has shut down the internet, which has greatly limited the ability of people in far-flung areas of Iran to know what's going on somewhere else. I'm sure some news gets through, but probably to a lesser extent. I don't think Iran is going to be free of protests going forward. Blood has been shed, people are very angry, and the Islamic Republic really has no way in which it could either improve the economic situation of the people, address their security issues, or address their other grievances. The key issue is whether the protesters can be in the streets in large enough numbers that can overwhelm the security forces. I don't know the answer to that because we're still early in these protests, and also because it's very difficult to get credible information out of Iran. We know the protesters are there, and we know that they're being cracked down against, that many people have died. But we don't know if the protests are growing or dwindling. We don't know exactly what the situation is. So we have to wait and see, after these first few days, where the dust will settle.
Yeah, it has been indeed difficult to get a clear picture, especially on the number of people, number of protesters killed. I want to play you now, Vali, another clip of the interview with President Pejaiskian, where he spoke about US and Israeli involvement in the unrest. Let's listen to that.
The United States and Israel are sitting there, giving instructions to these people, telling them, go ahead, we are backing you. The same ones who struck this country and killed our young people and our children are now giving them orders, telling them, you do this work, we are with you. You go and carry out acts of sabotage, and we will support you from behind.
We've heard this blame, the Iranian officials blame the US and Israel for fueling the unrest. We've heard the threats and the warnings from Tehran. They are tough in their rhetoric. But internally, Vali, what calculations do you think are happening? And to what extent does Iran and Iranian leaders fear a scenario like Venezuela today?
Well, I think, yes, they are laying the blame on the protesters, trying to delegitimate them. But I think they actually do believe that the protests are part of America and Israel's war strategy. And right or wrong, that's a very powerful motivation for them to crack down and to also threaten the United States. I mean, and also that President Trump has come in very forcefully in support of the protesters, threatening war on Iran. So for the Iran's leadership, the protests and American-Israeli war on Iran are not separate issues. They are part of the same thing. Now, a Venezuela scenario is not easy with Iran because Iran's leadership is not one man, and also it's not very easy to access them. And also Tehran is much farther away from the closest port or American vessel in the Gulf than Caracas was from an American ship, and you could fly in helicopters. And second, Iran also has capability of missiles, etc., to hit back. But there's one parallel that is very powerful in the minds of, I think, Iran's leadership, and that is that the United States really did not want regime change in Venezuela. It only removed the president of the country and his wife in a show of, force. And then it basically put on the table a proposal for the regime to work with them, and then threatened that if they didn't agree, he would put an economic blockade on Venezuela. But at no point did he contemplate actually putting troops on the ground or actually changing the regime in Venezuela by force. And so the Iranian leadership may think that the United States may hope that either the protesters or a targeted American strike would eliminate the supreme leader or a number of key Iranian leaders. And then the United States basically would try to force whatever is left of the Islamic Republic to do what the supreme leader currently refuses to do on nuclear issue, missile issues, and a host of other issues. So I think the reading of Venezuela is that the U.S. is dangerously active in Iran. The United States wants to change the game in Iran, but the United States is not about to invade Iran with troops. And the United States is not necessarily after regime change and nation building of the kind we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Okay, so we've heard President Trump reports that he's scheduled to be briefed by senior officials on specific options to respond to these protests in Iran, and you believe that a Venezuela scenario is unlikely. In that case, what do you think Iran can give in order for the US and even Europe to lift the sanctions, the snapback sanctions, because the protests we're seeing ultimately are a result of the economic crisis that Iran has experienced following the snapback being returned. This was disastrous for Iran. What concessions can the leadership realistically make today?
I think none. I don't think President Trump was interested in negotiating with Iran after he bombed Iran's nuclear facilities. He was interested in receiving Iran's surrender, but not to negotiate. And that's because he thinks he already has taken care of Iran's nuclear program, so he doesn't need to negotiate with Iran. And so that puts the Iranian leadership in a very, very tough position. And I think they're not thinking that far ahead. Right now, they're thinking about surviving this moment and then seeing where did they go from here. So they feel like that the United States has turned the tables on them by destroying their nuclear program. Now is supporting an uprising in Iran, is threatening to support regime change in Iran. And so Iranians are nowhere close to having a conversation about sanctions relief right now. I think that argument has receded to a distant point into the future. And that's the problem for the Islamic Republic. In other words, even if it survives these protests right now, it really doesn't have a way to get out of the quandary that it's facing. It has been facing since June.
Thank you so much for your insight. It was very interesting to talk to you and hear your thoughts about what's happening in Iran. Vali Nasser, Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't miss out. Get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.